Hey everybody, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Janda, also known as Joseph, and this is the history of the world. For those of you who are new here, we are making our way chronologically through the history of the world week by week, currently at the rate of 100 years to an episode. The year is now 1300 BCE, and we have another century of history ahead of us. The last century was a pretty tumultuous one. In the world's main center of power around the Fertile Crescent, aka this crescent, the Mitanni kingdom here mostly collapsed after being defeated by the Hittites and suffering a civil war, and is now basically a remnant state stuck between the Hittites, or Hatti, and the Assyrians, or Assur, and are also pretty much a Hittite vassal, hence the light pink they went with on this map. Assyria reasserted its independence during the collapse and has become a regional power, although they've immediately begun feuding with Babylon to the south. The new kingdom in Egypt experienced a major religious crisis due to the pharaoh Akhenaten's attempts to create a semi-monotheistic religion, but in the end came through without a major civil war and only slightly reduced in territory, losing Amuru up here to the Hittites. Relations between the New Kingdom and the Hittites are very poor, though, and war over the contested part of Syria up here looks likely, to be honest. The Mycenaean civilization in Greece is continuing to slowly spread its way through the Aegean and into western Anatolia, while agriculture is very slowly spreading throughout Europe and the rest of the world in general, particularly via trade and colonization in the Mediterranean. India is beginning to establish a new centralized state after the Indo-Aryan migrations into the subcontinent. China is under the rule of the Shang Dynasty, which has united the most developed regions of China along the Yellow River for several centuries now. We do also have a small, but apparently lasting civilization in the Americas at last, the Olmecs. So, the New Kingdom was finally stabilized after the Atenism religious crisis by this guy, Horemheb. A general not related by blood to the royal family. He's ruled for nearly 20 years by 1300, assuming the longer estimated dates for his reign are accurate. In the course of that reign, he has undone nearly all the remaining forms of Akhenaten, restored the former prominence of Amun and the pantheon as a whole, and rebuilt the bureaucracy and military of Egypt. The New Kingdom, therefore, by 1300 is once again in a very strong position. Certainly by the time Horemheb dies in about 1292 BCE. Having taken only 2 known wives and no sons, which is not that many wives by Egyptian standards, he names his vizier Paramessu as his heir, a man from a military family who Horemheb had appointed high priest of Set during his reign in order to help ensure the loyalty of the priesthood. Now Paramessu is already an old man with grandchildren when he takes the throne, and crowns himself Ramses I. Given his age, it's hardly surprising that Ramses does not have a long reign, and we don't know much about what kind of actions he takes aside from some minor construction orders. He dies after, at most, about 2 years on the throne, but his reign is considered to mark the official foundation of the 19th dynasty. His son, by his wife Sitre, follows him as Seti I. Seti I is younger and more warlike, probably middle-aged to be fair, and in the first year of his reign he campaigns into Canaan and Lebanon, reasserts Egyptian control, which may have lapsed a bit during the Aten crisis and its aftermath. He also later campaigns into Libya and Nubia, and significantly further north into the border territories of Amuru, which were lost to the Hittites during Akhenaten's reign. He apparently defeats a Hittite army and takes the city of Kadesh, which is the key to the region, but he's unable to leave a sufficient garrison to hold it, as it's much closer to the Hittite homeland than Egypt's, and the next year the Hittites retake Kadesh. He weds Tuya, the daughter of a military officer, and also Tanadjemet, who is possibly a daughter of Horemheb. He has at least one daughter, Tia, probably another Henutmeyer, and at least one known son, Ramses, all by Tuya. He claims a lot of military success on his known monuments, but except for the taking of Kadesh, these are mostly maintaining and defending actions. Nonetheless, Seti enhances the stability and prosperity of Egypt. And it's possible he might have done more later in his reign, if not for his death at a still relatively young age of unknown causes after an 11-year reign in 1279 BCE. His son Ramses follows him on the throne as Ramses II. Ramses is a young man when he takes the throne, probably just over 20 years old, and he will prove to be an outstandingly vigorous ruler, both on campaign and at home. By the time he takes the throne, piracy has become rampant in the Mediterranean, preying on the rich trade of the late Bronze Age and taking advantage of no one really has dedicated warships. As the Egyptians do have a navy, as probably do other powers, but warships don't have that clear of a speed advantage, I would say, except in short-term rowing actions, and they have no ability to attack ships except by boarding, so nor are these necessarily large, dedicated permanent navies, so piracy has become quite rampant, a bit unchecked. And Ramses takes the first known large-scale anti-piracy action. He stations ships and men at strategic points along the coastline of Egypt and Palestine and deliberately lures the pirates in before crushing them in a decisive action. So decisive that many of the Sheridan pirates apparently submit to him and become members of his military and bodyguard. By the 4th year of his reign, he campaigns in Canaan and then into Syria, taking parts of Amurru. The Egyptian feud with the Hittites finally comes to a head in the 5th year of the reign of Ramses II, 1274 BCE, when he attempts to retake Kadesh as his father previously had. This time the Hittites are fully prepared to meet him, under their own king, Muwatalli II. And what follows is nothing less than the greatest battle of the Bronze Age, and quite frankly the largest chariot battle ever fought. Ramses here, who we see smiting his enemies with a spear while trampling upon another, has a much larger army than his predecessor Thutmose III had at Megiddo a couple of centuries ago. Perhaps the result of facing a much larger opponent, perhaps a result of an increase in Egypt's resources. The Egyptian army that he brings with is actually large enough to be divided into 4 divisions: Amun, Ra, Set, and Ta, the last of which is newly raised for this campaign. There's also a 5th division, the Nirn of unknown origin. These are possibly Canaanite mercenaries instead of sort of regulars of the Egyptian army. Now, this army numbers at a minimum some 20,000 men, including at least 2,000 chariots with 500 to a division. Not that crazy a number, bearing in mind chariots are pretty much 2 or 3 man vehicles, so it's not that crazy to have 2,000 of them. Some estimates do place the army at as much as twice that size, but we'll say 20,000 men with 2,000 chariots. The Hittite army is similarly sized, but apparently fields even more chariots, at least according to the Egyptian accounts, which we must keep in mind are extraordinarily biased, as they're pretty much all straight-up pharaoh propaganda. Now, the Egyptians use 2-man chariots at this time. The Hittites use 3-man chariots. The Egyptian chariots are therefore faster, but have 1 less man to fight on them, and so don't do well in a head-to-head engagement. Moving north towards Kadesh, Ramses is misled by several local shepherds into believing the Hittite army is still at Aleppo, several hundred kilometers to the north. By the time his scouts reveal that the Hittite army is already present at Kadesh waiting for him, Ramses is already setting up camp, not far from Kadesh himself, with only the Amun division actually present, and himself leading it personally in the vanguard. The Ra division is coming down the road towards him. The Ta and Set divisions are strung out well behind, along with the Nirn, who are circling around to the north. It's roughly May of 1274 BCE. When Ramses gets the news that the Hittites are near, he orders his vizier Passer to hasten the arrival of the Set and Ta divisions, but well before they arrive, the Hittites spot the arriving Egyptians and act. Their large chariot force, probably 2,000 or so chariots themselves, if not more, crosses the Orontes River at Kadesh and charges the Ra division while it's still on the march towards the Egyptian camp, routing and scattering it completely. A portion does flee in the direction of the Egyptian camp to rally, albeit in great disorder. The Hittite chariots realize their numerical advantage and wheel north to attack the Egyptian camp. They crash through the hastily formed line of the Amun division and into the camp. Ramses himself is allegedly caught in the chaos and has to fight his way free, although he probably exaggerates this a little. He certainly at least would have had a lot of bodyguards. In any case, the Hittites then make their fatal error. Having driven the Egyptians from their camp, they prematurely believe they've won a complete victory and begin looting the camp, scattering and dismounting their chariots. Some chariots crash into tents or ditches inside the camp and overturn. Ramses rallies the remains of the Amun and Ra divisions outside of the camp and charges back into the camp, catching the looting Hittites off guard and routing them in turn. They flee towards the Orontes River, but their heavy chariots are outpaced by the Egyptians and they suffer quite heavily in a pursuit engagement. Seeing this, Muwatalli II commits his reserve. Another 1,000 chariots cross the Orontes and charge the Egyptian camp. But by this time, hours have passed as this fighting has gone by, and the orders sent out to hasten the arrival of the other Egyptian divisions finally pay off. First, the Niran arrive from the north to help defend the Egyptian camp, and then the Ta division comes marching up the road from the south into the Hittite rear. The Hittites launch 6 charges, and fighting is furious around and throughout the Egyptian camp, but in the end, the arrival of the remainder of the army, except the Set division, which is last on the road and never gets to the fight, turns the tide in Egypt's favor, and the Hittites are driven back to the Orontes. Many have to abandon their chariots and swim across because they can't get to the ford. Some drown in the process. In the end, well, according to the Egyptians, the greatest battle of the Bronze Age is an Egyptian victory. Practically, it's more or less indecisive, at least strategically. The Egyptians obviously inflict heavy losses on the Hittite chariot arm, but the Ra and Amun divisions of the Egyptian army are pretty much shattered, and the supply train is probably damaged with the sacking of the camp. Ultimately, although Ramses technically holds the field and wins the day, he's unable to take Kadesh. The city's walled, and he has no logistical ability to sustain a siege. Whether he ever did is unclear. Maybe his ability to take it was always dependent on either surprise or winning a major field victory to demoralize the defenders, or maybe his logistical train was ruined by the Hittite attack on his camp. Either way, he doesn't have the capacity to sustain a siege, especially with the undamaged Hittite infantry force still near, and ultimately Ramses withdraws south to Damascus, which is then a newly founded young city in Syria and today is one of the oldest in the world. In fact, in the aftermath, various Canaanite princes actually rebel against the Egyptians, and most of the next year of Ramses' reign is spent crushing the rebellion and getting Canaan back under control, as they were encouraged by the Hittite victory. It's not till 1272 that he's able to campaign into Syria again, splitting his army in two and retaking much of the area, including Damascus, which was lost 2 years prior, shortly after he left. Further campaigns follow in the next 2 years, which are actually much more successful than the famous Kadesh campaign. He campaigns far north of Kadesh into Amuru and lays siege to this city, Dapur, which he takes with the use of these ladders, and probably not with the use of chariot archery, really, but you can see him running over his enemies and everything. It's very exciting. Most of these victories are ephemeral, though. It's all but impossible for Egypt to station garrisons large enough this far north to repel Hittite attacks in the northern parts of Syria, and the yearly campaigns are mostly retaking ground that was lost during the winter of the previous year. Unfortunately, Ramses' greatest lasting military achievement will actually be a diplomatic one. In 1259 BCE, Ramses II and Hattusili III of the Hittite Empire agree to a peace treaty on behalf of their respective empires, which fixes the border in Syria and allows them to focus on their other borders and enemies. This is sometimes called the Silver Treaty, as both copies, the Egyptian and Hittite copies, are carved on silver tablets, and it is the earliest peace treaty of its type, the earliest for which the copies held by both sides have survived. For the rest of the exceptional reign of Ramses the Great, The northern border will remain quiet. He does also campaign into Nubia and Libya against less grand opponents, evidently with success, but these are mostly punitive and anti-rebellion and raiding expeditions. Despite the famous Battle of Kadesh and his military achievements in general, most of the long reign of Ramses the Great is dedicated to building in Egypt, even before the war with the Hittites is over, but especially afterwards. As early as the third year of his reign, Ramses undertakes an extremely ambitious building program. He builds a new capital, Pi-Ramses, near his summer palace in the northeastern Nile Delta, likely in order to be closer to Syria, in order to provide a better jumping-off point for his campaigns, which are launched almost yearly into that region at the time. It includes vast temples and a large residential palace complete with its own zoo. He also builds a particularly spectacular mortuary temple by New Kingdom standards, called the Ramesseum, which is what you see here. It includes a statue of himself 17 meters high, along with other fine examples of New Kingdom architecture. He builds the great rock-cut temples of Abu Simbel in Nubia, which several millennia later will be lifted wholesale several hundred meters to avoid being submerged beneath the Nile after the construction of the Aswan Dam, which is a totally crazy and remarkable achievement all in itself, but is also a spoiler for roughly 3,500 years from now, or 3,300 years from now, so we'll get to that much later. Piles of other temples, statues, and buildings of all sorts are also attributed to him for their construction or are heavily remodeled by him. He tends to carve his own name in pride of place over other pharaohs' names afterwards, so not all of these are totally certain. Now, family-wise, during his reign, Ramses takes a very great number of wives. Notable known wives include Nefertari, who is prominent at court during his reign and corresponds with foreign rulers in her own right. Isetnefrot, who succeeds her as the first wife after her death several decades into the reign of Ramses. Mathorneferur, a daughter of the Hittite king Hattusili III, whose hand seals the Silver Treaty. Meritamen, who is Ramses' own daughter by Nefertari, and gets more disturbing and incestual as we go down the list. Bintanath, his daughter by Isetnefrot. Nebetawi, another of his daughters, probably by Nefertari, and Hanutmire, who's probably his sister. By these and numerous lesser wives, Ramses has a truly staggering number of offspring. A minimum of 88 recorded children of Ramses the Great, with up to 103 suspected and perhaps more who weren't significant enough to be preserved for posterity. For the first 25 years of Ramses' reign, his eldest son with Nefertari, Amun-Herkhepesef, is crown prince, but Amun-Herkhepesef predeceases Ramses. He's followed as expected heir by Isetnefrot's eldest son, Ramses. Old Ramses Jr. also predeceases his father, despite spending 25 more years himself as crown prince. He's probably near 60 by the time he dies, but he still doesn't outlive Ramses the Great. He's followed as crown prince by Isetnefrot's second son, Kamweset. Kamweset is sometimes called the first Egyptologist because of his efforts to restore and preserve the pyramids. Keep in mind that most of the pyramids are already well over 1,000 years old by now, and the Egyptians of Ramses' time are thinking of Old Kingdom stuff the same way we would think of, like, the medieval period. Kamweset is heir for 5 years before being followed by a third son of Isetnefrot upon his death, likely the 13th overall son of Ramses, with presumably the previous 12 sons all predeceasing him. This 13th son, who actually lives to take the throne, is Merneptah. Ramses the Great, known in Greek as Ozymandias and subject of the famous poem about how Timon does all works, dies in 1213 BCE, having taken the throne in 1279. His reign is 66 years, and he is probably roughly 90 years of age upon his death. This exceptional reign, all of it as an adult, has defined a century of prosperity for the New Kingdom. And his poor ultimate heir here, Merneptah, is likely already almost 70 by the time he takes the throne. He is married to his Setnefrot II, either his full sister or possibly a niece by Caemweset, and possibly a Takat, although this is not clear. By them he has at least 2 sons, Merneptah and Seti, and a daughter, Tausret. He's forced to campaign mainly against the Libyans. They assault the western borders of Egypt during his reign. It seems like a famine of some sort forces the various tribes to unite under a warlord known as Meryi, who leads them to Egypt in hopes of settling on better land. They hire a contingent of the so-called Sea Peoples, which is an exciting name drop for some of you, I'm sure. The Sea Peoples are a loose confederation of assorted semi-seafaring tribes from across the Mediterranean, probably some originating in the Mediterranean and some originating from further north in Europe due to migrations, or else their numbers much swelled by migrants from northern Europe. Initially, the Libyans and their mercenaries meet with much success. They overrun part of the western Nile Delta, but they only have infantry, mostly light infantry from the Libyans. The Sea Peoples are rather heavier infantry, but when the Egyptian army proper is mobilized and meets them at the Battle of Perire, the Libyans are completely routed. Egyptian archers largely decimate their ranks, and a chariot charge breaks them, proving practically unstoppable by an army that doesn't have chariots. The dead are impaled on spikes as a warning to future invaders, which is considered a particularly harsh punishment by Egyptian standards, and likely means that the pharaohs were particularly concerned about or offended by this intrusion. Now, Merneptah's reign, unsurprisingly, is not a hugely long one. Not bad at all, considering his age when he takes the throne. He rules about 10 years and dies in 1203 BCE at the age of about 80. The succession, unfortunately, is not smooth. Perhaps not a surprising result of a king who died 10 years ago with probably something like 70 living children. You can imagine the horrifying mess of potential succession claimants this would produce. Officially, the heir is Merneptah's son, Seti, who takes the throne as Seti II. This is him. He is shortly challenged by one Amennes here, a son of a woman named Takat by either Merneptah or Ramses the Great. We're not entirely clear. Either way, essentially a textbook rival claimant from within the royal family. How he managed to get enough support for this, who knows, but when there's this much complicated and feuding family involved, it's always possible to drum up support for somebody. Seti initially seems to have the situation under control, but in 1201, Amennes is able to take Thebes with the aid of his supporters, which leaves Egypt split in half between the two rival pharaohs, Amennes ruling the south, or Upper Egypt, and Seti the north, or Lower Egypt. Just as outside threats, the Sea Peoples, the Libyans, rebellious Canaanites, and etc. are attaining heights not seen in centuries. 1200 BCE finds the New Kingdom divided, vulnerable, despite what was a century of great strength and prosperity on the whole. One little succession dispute puts the whole kingdom in great peril at this time. But more on that in the next episode. Outside of Egypt, the north is divided between 3 great kingdoms in 1300. Egypt is the greatest of the 4 kingdoms of this era, but there are 3 others, and they don't have the benefit of convenient geography and desert protection like Egypt does. The Hittite Empire remains the strongest power of the world in the second strongest after Egypt, but the strongest of these 3 in 1300. But the Middle Assyrian Empire and Kassite Babylon are also great powers in the wake of the collapse of the Mitanni kingdom. The Hittites in 1300 are ruled by Mersili II, who rules a stable and powerful empire after inheriting it as a young man. Initially, there was some chaos, but he's now a veteran king with 25 years on the throne. Syria and Babylon are ruled respectively by much younger, more recently enthroned men, Adad-nirari I of Assyria and Natsi-Marutash of Babylon. They continue the feud of their fathers and grandfathers by making war on each other. Mursili II dies in 1295 after a long and ultimately successful reign. He has at least 3 sons by his first wife, Gasulawiya, the elder 2 of which are Muwatalli and Hattusili. Upon Mursili's death, Muwatalli, as the elder son, takes the throne and proceeds to rule for over 2 decades in his own right, successfully enough. He moves the capital from Hattusa to Tarhuntasa, possibly a result of the frequent raids on Hattusa due to its northern peripheral location in the empire. He names his brother Hattusili, meanwhile, as governor of Hattusa to hold the place down. Muwatalli's primary concern for most of his reign is the feud with the new kingdom over Syria, and towards the end of his reign he fights the Battle of Kadesh against Ramses II, and wins at least a strategic stalemate, or in practice perhaps even an outright victory of sorts. Mursili has at least 2 sons of his own, Mursili and Karunta, by his wife Tanuhepa, and is succeeded on his death by the older son, Mursili, as Mursili III. Meanwhile, to the east, the Assyrians and Babylons are still at war. They clash at the Battle of Kar Ishtar, the exact dating not certain, probably during the 1280s, and the Assyrians win a major victory. This doesn't settle the feud forever, but it does for this generation. They annex a swath of territory in the north of Babylon's domain, and pretty much secure that flank for a time. Adad-nirari I is an ambitious king, and he takes full advantage of the breathing space afforded by that victory. He swings west and invades the remnants of the Mitanni kingdom. Nominally a Hittite vassal, but apparently they were attempting to assert their independence at this time when the Hittites focused on Syria. Actually, the Assyrian account of events claims the Mitanni remnants, under a king Shatuara, strike first and attack Assyria. Whether that's true or not, they lose. They are crushed by the Assyrians and turned into an Assyrian vassal. They rebel again under Shatuara's son Washashata later in Adad-nirari's reign, and are crushed again, with several Mitanni cities sacked and Washashata dragged to Assur in chains. An Assyrian governor is then appointed over the region, and the remnants of the Mitanni kingdom are effectively annexed into the growing Assyrian empire. In Babylon, Natsi-Marutash is followed by his son, Kadashman-Turgu, who hastily seeks a peace with Assyria after the defeat suffered at Kar Ishtar near the end of his father's reign, and Kadashman-Turgu will largely remain at peace for the rest of his reign, to such an extent that other rulers will later tell his son that Kadashman-Turgu prepares for war, but then stays at home. In the Hittite Empire, all is not well. Mursili III's reign is somewhat stable to start with, but the Assyrian conquest of the Mitanni is a significant blow to the security and prestige of the Hittite Empire, and Mursili III becomes increasingly concerned about the plotting of his uncle Hattusili. He moves the capital back to Hattusa, removing Hattusili as governor of that city, but eventually he becomes too concerned, too paranoid, and he decides to launch a preemptive strike and seize the remaining strongholds held by Hattusili. The result is a full-blown rebellion. Hattusili is a successful general, well respected throughout the empire, and he quickly gathers a large force and is able to depose his nephew and seize the throne as Hattusili III. In a sense justifying that paranoia against him, but perhaps the rebellion never would have happened if his hand hadn't been forced. Mursili III flees to Egypt. This precipitates a crisis which nearly causes the war between the two to resume in earnest. Ramses the Great refuses to extradite Mursili, but ultimately it's this that causes Ramses and Hattusili III to finally agree to the Silver Treaty, which ends the war for good, and Mursili III promptly more or less disappears from the pages of history. Either the Egyptians kill him to avoid embarrassment after the peace or as part of the terms of the peace, or he's just lives in exile in some insignificant location for the remainder of his life. Hattusili III therefore secures the throne for himself. Interestingly, Babylon politically backs Hattusili during this dispute, while Assyria seems to at least vaguely back Egypt, which suggests the creation of a pair of rival alliances of sorts, not a firm one or a by treaty-bound alliance necessarily, not set in stone, but power blocks. Now, Hattusili III's reign is not actually exceptionally active after the rather violent and dramatic circumstances of his ascension, and he will remain mostly at peace with his neighbors. Whoa. Hattusili is... Soon after Hattusili III's ascension, Adad-nirari I dies and is succeeded as king of Assyria by his son, Shalmaneser I. Shalmaneser will campaign regularly and aggressively during his reign, mostly, with Babylon subdued for the moment, to the west and north. He completes the annexation of the Mitanni kingdom and various minor polities. He claims to have blinded 14,400 prisoners in one eye during his wars, and is probably the first to adopt what will later become a common Assyrian practice, forcibly deporting or moving his defeated enemies and their populations from one portion of the empire to another to remove local support and stability for them, and intermix them such that a united rebellion is unlikely, instead of simply killing them. He builds palaces and temples in Assur and Nineveh, and expands the empire. By the end of Shalmaneser's reign, the Assyrian Empire's border is planted firmly on the Euphrates River. To the south, Kadashman-Turgu of Babylon dies after a reign of 17 years and is followed by Kadashman-Enlil II, who is only a child when he takes the throne. For most of his reign, a powerful vizier by the name of Iti-Marduk-Balatu holds effective power, and he takes a much more hostile stance to the Hittites than Kadashman-Turgu. At some points, he apparently declines to even communicate regularly. And he also turns down Hittite offers to go to war with the Assyrians, despite Hattusili III's urging. Kadashman-Enlil II ultimately dies young after only 8 years on the throne, having only briefly ruled in his own right, and is followed by Kudur-Enlil, possibly a younger brother. Kudur-Enlil marries his sister or daughter to Hattusili III's son, not himself. We're not Egyptian over in Babylon. No, he makes a diplomatic marriage to the Hittites, and oversees a considerable expansion of Nippur. He expands and renovates the temple of Enlil, which is, after all, one of his namesakes. His reign, however, is not long either. He rules 8 or 9 years on the throne, despite not being old at all when he takes it. And in about 1256, depending on the chronology, and it is a little iffy in this period, he's followed by his likely son, Sagaragti-Surius. By the time of his reign, it seems Babylon's economy is beginning to really struggle, although he does build at least one new shrine to Ishtar, but there's clearly some poverty and unrest. Just to refresh and resynchronize, because I realize I'm talking about 3 kingdoms in not precisely chronological order here. By 1250, halfway through the century, the 3 major kingdoms here are Hattusili III of the Hittites, ruling for 25 years now, Shalmaneser I of Assyria, on the throne either 15 or 25 years himself, and Sagaragti-Surius of Babylon on the throne only about 5 years by the middle chronology. And for reference to Egypt, Ramses the Great has now ruled Egypt for about 30 years and has nearly another 40 left on the throne. None of these 3 kings live long into the second half of the century. Hattusili III is the first to die in about 1245 BCE. He is married to Pudu-Hepa, a priestess of the local variant of Ishtar, and a very powerful woman in her own right, who has her own official seal and negotiates with Ramses at some point on her husband's behalf, as well as being the driving force behind the diplomatic marriages with Egypt and Babylon. Hattusili III has 3 children by her, the eldest, Nerakeli, but he's ultimately disinherited by Hattusili deliberately, in favor of the younger son, who takes the throne as Tudhaliya IV. Unfortunately for Tudhaliya, events entirely outside his control take over shortly after he takes the throne, as the Hittites begin suffering a serious drought, possibly an outright climate change in Anatolia. He builds at least 13 dams to store water, one of which at Alakahoyuk survives to the present day, an earth dam. Just a year or so later, Shalmaneser I dies, and is succeeded by his son, Tukulti-Ninurta I. And a year after that, Sagaragti-Surius dies, and is succeeded by Castiliusur, Castiliash IV in Babylon. 3 new kings on the throne in 3 years. Does that mean a time of peace? Prosperity? No, it means they need to prove themselves. Tukulti-Ninurta in particular is extremely ambitious. This is him here. And in 1237, the Battle of Neria is fought between Assyria and the Hittites. The Assyrians win a major victory over the Hittite Empire, large enough to shake Tudalia's control over the empire itself. He suffers several revolts. Some territory comes under the effective control of the deposed Mursili III's younger brother Karunta, who's been sort of left alone and alive in the south as a minor governor to avoid any further trouble. With the Hittites beaten and distracted, Tukulti-Ninurta I turns his attention southwards to Abalon's great ancestral enemy, Babylon. According to the Assyrian accounts, it's actually Babylon that starts the war, though this might be propaganda. In any case, it is the Assyrians who finish the war. Tukulti-Ninurta petitions the sun god Shamash, and then advances south, ultimately winning a crushing victory over the Babylonians. Kashtiliash IV is captured. Tukulti-Ninurta symbolically steps on his neck and then has him dragged ignominiously in chains to Assyria. Babylon itself is soon after sacked, the walls torn down, the statue of Marduk stolen. The exact chronology of events here is not entirely clear. It seems that Kashtiliash IV is immediately followed by 3 weak, short-reigned kings in succession. It's not totally clear whether these overlap with a period of Assyrian dominance or take place before it. The most likely sequence that I'm going with or endorsing is that Tukulti-Ninurta doesn't actually seize Babylon in the same campaign as his capture of Kashtiliash IV, but rather departs and returns several years later to finish Babylon off. And in that void between the capture of Kashtiliash and the actual sacking of Babylon, these several weak kings exist. These kings suffer heavily from raiding from Elam, and ultimately are all deposed. Eventually, Tukulti-Ninurta returns and imposes an Assyrian governor after sacking Babylon, turning Babylon completely into a vassal state of Assyria, and bringing the Middle Assyrian Empire to its height. Now, basically the dominant state of the Fertile Crescent, with the Hittites humbled, Babylon reduced to a vassal. He wages war against the Elamites as well, and drives them back into Elam, thereby eliminating any competition for control of Babylon. However, this Assyrian dominance is never entirely stable. The sacking of Babylon's temples is seen as sacrilegious even in Assyria, and apparently infuriates the priests of Assur. This causes Tukulti-Ninurta to begin constructing a new capital for himself just north of Assur, which he calls Kar-Tukulti-Ninurta. Very creative, basically himself. After 7 years of unchallenged Assyrian dominance, a revolt among some of the officers of the army, presumably mostly those of some sympathetic or Babylonian descent, puts Adad Shuma Usur, a son of Kashtiliash IV, onto the throne of Babylon. He doesn't actually rule Babylon, which certainly hurts his claim, but he is crowned in Ur to the south, and does have effective control over the coastal regions of Mesopotamia, it would seem. He's able to hold it, perhaps because of, well, the chaos or the problematic political situation of Tukulti-Ninurta within Assyria. Although he's not able to make significant gains as long as Tukulti-Ninurta rules in Assyria, Adad Shuma Usur keeps the flame of Babylonian independence alive, starting in about 1222. In about 1215, Tudaliya IV dies, ruler of an intact but much weakened Hittite empire. He's succeeded by the first of his 2 sons, Arnuanda III, but Arnuanda rules only 5 years before his apparently early death, and is followed in turn by his younger brother, Suppiluliuma II. The Hittite situation is precarious. There is a lot of political instability. He's still technically threatened by his cousin from the Mercilia III's brother, Kuntura. There is famine brought on by the ongoing drought. Subluliumo puts down several rebellions in southwestern Anatolia and Cyprus, possibly crushes the descendants of Mercilia III in the process, but it's not quite enough to end the crisis. By 1200, the Hittite Empire is at a critical moment. Beset by raids from the sea, likely the loose confederation of tribes known as the Sea Peoples that have also harassed Egypt lately, and by land from other raiders, possibly still facing internal struggles, and stricken by a serious drought, possibly a matter of mid to long-term climate change instead of just a brief phase. Whether it can stand for much longer is in serious doubt. The long and illustrious reign of Tukulti-Ninurta I, in which he brought the Middle Assyrian Empire to the height of its power, comes to a rather ignominious end in about 1207, when his own sons rebel against him and besiege his new capital. The siege ends not with a battle, but with Tukulti-Ninurta's murder by an unknown assassin. His son Ashur-nadin Apli takes power, but lasts only 3 years before his own death in 1203 of unknown causes. His successor, his sons take the throne in turn. His son takes the throne in turn as Ashur-nirari III, but Ashur-nirari is young and in an obviously unstable position with at least one and likely several other sons of Tukulti-Ninurta, his uncles, all jockeying for power themselves. Meanwhile, Adad Shuma Usur is gathering momentum in southern Mesopotamia, retaking cities, not missing the chance to take advantage of the chaos in Assyria, and he even sends a highly insulting letter to Adad Nirari III, addressing him as a subordinate and accusing him of slovenliness, drunkenness, and indecisiveness. By 1200, the Middle Assyrian Empire is crumbling almost as badly as the Hittite Empire, with civil war, rebellion, and external attack threatening to bring the entire empire crashing down. All told, you probably get the picture by now. In 1200, nearly all the kingdoms of the Near East are struggling, quite abruptly. The result of the combination of external pressure from the Sea Peoples and other migratory groups, and poorly timed internal struggles in practically all of them. With them, the great long-established civilization of the late Bronze Age is beginning to come down. With the instability in these kingdoms, the civilization of the late Bronze Age is beginning to come crashing down, thanks to a combination of external pressure from the Sea Peoples and other migratory and raiding tribes, and poorly timed internal struggles. Numerous small vassal states are left very exposed to each other and external raiders, which will lead to the destruction of many of them in the next few decades. But we'll discuss the Bronze Age collapse more in the next episode. The situation in Mycenae is no better. In about 1250, a first wave of violence sweeps the region, with Thebes, apparently, burned to the ground. It will be rebuilt, but nonetheless. It seems likely that migrations from the north, likely including those who will shortly become the Dorian Greeks, sweep across Greece during this time and cause significant turmoil and destruction. Despite this, the Mycenaean civilization holds together for the remainder of the century, and on several occasions are again identified interfering in western Anatolia and clashing with the Hittites. Still, based on events that will come soon, it's clear that Mycenae is also struggling by 1200, probably a result of migrations and perhaps the general disruption of trade would be having a heavy impact on this civilization, which is heavily trade-based. To the east, things are much more stable. There's very little hard information on events in India, but this centrally century generally is a time in which the Kuru tribal union or kingdom in the northwest of the subcontinent is sort of developing, and in which they are achieving some cultural homogeneity through the evolution of the Vedas and the religious system known as Brahmanism, both of which will remain at least somewhat influential in Indian culture and religion up to the present. More secure information is available for China, albeit still mostly in the form of oracle bones. In 1300, the Shang Dynasty remains the dominant power in China, ruling mainly along the Yellow River, but stretching in places as far south as the Yangtze River. The ruler in 1300 is Yang Jia, who rules about another 10 years for a total reign of 17 before his death. He's followed by his younger brother, Pan Geng. Pan Geng moves the Shang capital to what will prove to be its final and most famous location, Yinshu, near present-day Anyang. It's here that the oracle bone writing that will record the previous kings actually emerges, or at least is preserved for later generations, and ultimately Yinshu will be one of China's most important and famous archaeological sites. This aside, not much of great significance seems to take place during Pan Geng's reign, which apparently lasts 28 years. He dies in 1263 and is succeeded by another younger brother, Shaoxin, who almost certainly must be quite old by the time of taking the throne, and in fact rules only 3 years before his death in about 1260. He's followed by yet another younger brother, Xiao Yi, who manages to rule for a surprisingly long 10 years before his death in about 1250. Xiao Yi is likely at last the final living brother and is succeeded by a son, Wu Ding. Wu Ding is the first Shang king who is definitively attested from contemporary sources in the form of the oracle bones, such as this one, most of which, or a great number of which, were created during his reign. They do clearly attest to the prior Shang rulers as well, and show an existing literary tradition, so we can take the previous Shang rulers as factual as well. But Wu Ding and his successors are somewhat better attested. Aside from the extremely useful, although ultimately mostly coincidental habit of marking the names of kings on the oracle bones, Wu Ding is a very heavy user in general of said oracle bones. He attempts to use them through ceremonial divining to learn anything from the sex of unborn children to next week's weather to deaths and disasters that might be approaching. He's apparently a pretty warlike ruler, although a well-respected and wise one. He conquers the Guifang to the north, the Dapeng and Tunwei to the east, and the Hufang to the south in separate campaigns, all various tribes of people outside the rule of the Shang. He brings them to heel, and significantly expands the borders of the Shang Dynasty. Too much, perhaps, as this also forces him to increasingly decentralize the administration, leaning more on relatively autonomous distant lords. Many prisoners are taken in the course of his conquests, and many are sacrificed in thanks for the victory, while others are used as slave labor. Wu Ding's reign also sees the first proof of astronomy in China, with various stars recorded on the oracle bones and a flourishing of the Shang in general, the quantity and quality of bronze working significantly increasing. Incidentally, Wu Ding's favorite wife, Fu Hao, is named a general in the army, and is apparently responsible for much of the expansion achieved by the Shang under his reign, a belief borne out by the discovery of many weapons, such as large battle axes in her tomb. In fact, although the Shang are certainly male-dominated, it seems clear there's quite a lot of leeway for women to serve in important roles still at this time. There are several other military women known from Wu Ding's reign, and another wife, Fu Jing, is apparently in charge of agricultural production. Wu Ding's reign is a very long one, and it seems that he still rules by 1200 BC, with the Shang still a stable and prosperous power, indeed larger and stronger than ever under a long-lived and capable king. In other events around the world, a surprisingly large battle is fought in northern Europe near the Baltic coast of what will one day be Germany. Nearly 1,000 people perish, suggesting several thousand at least fought here. Mainly men, but at least a few women. Considering there's no real organized civilization yet this far into Europe, this is a surprisingly large battle and suggests that although there are no written records or major population centers and the population density as a whole is low, There are fairly large tribes or other groups capable of mustering significant armies against each other, possibly related to the events that I'm about to speak about. There is a significant cultural transition in Europe during this century. The established tumulus culture of Central Europe is more or less replaced by the even more widespread so-called urnfield culture, known for cremating their dead and burying them in fields inside urns instead of the previous practice of burial mounds. And at around the same time, hilltop forts spread very widely across Europe, along with sheet metal bronze working. They also have a fair degree of agriculture, not as well organized and sophisticated as in the Mediterranean, but the urn fields grow wheat and barley, along with numerous other crops. They raise various animals, mainly cattle and pigs, but others as well. They work at least some bronze at the village level, although the finest items are probably often still from the Mediterranean. The exact nature of this tumulus to urnfield transition is not that clear, or what the battle that we know of might have been about, or many others. It seems some degree of mass migration or serious turmoil about this time in Central Europe can't be ruled out, and it might even be likely. It would sort of support the idea that if there's migrants coming in from the steppes, as tends to cyclically happen in Europe for a large part of its history, that would support the idea of the displaced former inhabitants being driven southwards into the Mediterranean around the same time, leading to or abetting the crisis there. But that's all very, very speculative and unproven, to be clear. The century also possibly sees the origin of a group of tribes in Canaan who call themselves Israel or Israelites. These are not all that sharply distinguished from any other Canaanite tribe at this time, but spoilers, they will one day go on to play a much larger role in history than most of their current neighbors. Now, it's possible that they include some escaped Egyptian slaves or subjects. They are almost certainly an Egyptian tributary like the rest of Canaan at this point. But the tale of the Exodus, which is theoretically dated to about this time, is almost certainly mythical pretty much in its entirety. There may be some grain of truth, as I said, about escaped Egyptian slaves forming part of the Israelites. Perhaps even all if they started out very small, but well, the tale itself won't even be set down for at least several hundred years from this date, and won't take on something close to its present form for several hundred more after that, which gives a lot of time for anything that did occur about this time to take on the aspect of a national myth much larger than whatever did occur. So that brings us to 1200 BCE across the board. The bulk of the century was a time of prosperity, if not peace. Egypt's new kingdom reached perhaps its greatest heights. Any decline in the Hittites and Babylon was matched by Assyria's ascendance. But as we reach 1200, as we reach the turn of the century, the world of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean is abruptly a world in crisis. All four great kingdoms are threatened by internal political struggle, hostile neighbors, possibly mass migrations from the north. The smaller, semi-independent polities around them, which were long largely protected as tributaries of one great kingdom or another, are left totally vulnerable amidst the chaos. India, meanwhile, is undergoing the cultural birth of the Vedic period, while in China the Shang Dynasty is reaching new heights of strength under Wu Ding, expanding and developing domestic bronze production. So the East is doing great. The Near East, however, well, the question as we reach 1200 BCE is simple enough. In this time of chaos, with the fall of great kingdoms, what will be known as the Bronze Age collapse. Who will stand? Who will fall? And whose civilizations will come through on the other side? Subscribe and tune in next time to find out.